Welcome to the Man Cave Podcast with Dan Casper.
He is Dr. Austin Crow, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine, joining us here this morning. Austin, how you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic.
Hey, before we get into it, since it is Valentine's Day, I know you don't fix broken hearts and such at Chippewa Valley. That was a corny joke. I apologize.
Yeah,
but who was your first, I'm trying to put a sports spin on this, your first favorite athlete as a kid when you were growing up?
First favorite athlete. Okay, that's a throwback. Probably Anthony Carter, the Vikings wide receiver.
Nice.
When I was a young kid. I had one of those old, I can't remember what brand they were, but those cheap plastic helmets and
the Hutch ones?
Yes, Hutch, that's what it was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously they had so my brother and I both had them. We played tackle football with them. They offer zero protection, right? You're just basically banging your head against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So I had AC, Anthony Carter, so he's probably pretty high on that list.
I had a Sterling Sharp one of those, so... Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Down memory lane. Hey, they still have those now. Like Hudson's got one, but now you can customize a number and all that. And it's not I remember ours came with shoulder pads. Now these don't even come with shoulder pads. So
yeah, well, I think they just probably realized that kids are using them as if they're real pads and they're not.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we lost a couple brain cells playing with those things.
The good old days back then. So
right.
Baseball season, we got spring training getting underway, pitchers and catchers reporting. So we've had a few players already being sidelined with injuries, and one of those is Brewers pitcher D.L. Hall, and Brewers are saying they're sidelining him for several weeks with a lat injury. Now, I know we've talked about lat injuries before in the past, but maybe a good kind of refresher. What exactly is a lat injury?
So the lat is the latissimus dorsi, so it's the big muscle kind of on the side of the body. So when real big muscular guys have that kind of V shape, that's the muscle that cuts out from the side up to the arm. So it is definitely involved in the throwing motion. So it really acts as kind of an adductor and pulls the arm down. So when a pitcher's throwing, as the arm kind of follows and pushes through, the lat is involved in that motion. So certainly not the most common injured muscle or tendon in a thrower. It's generally more likely to be up in and around the rotator cuff area, but you can certainly see it. So generally, if it's something like this, it's going to be either an injury to the muscle belly or the tendon itself, so kind of a tendonitis or a musculotendinous strain. So if it's an acute injury, which I would guess is in this case, usually it's going to be a couple weeks of giving it some TLC, and then they kind of get back into it. Obviously, when it comes to throwers and their arms and shoulders, it is definitely, teams want to play it slow. And so, especially this time of year, my guess is that they're going to give it a little extra time to make sure they get all the way healed before they try to get back into throwing.
I was looking at some of the injuries for all these teams and just kind of looking at different types of injuries. And one thing that I kind of noticed, you got, some players obviously coming back from Tommy John surgery, but then there's others that says left or right UCL reconstruction surgery. So what is the difference between Tommy John surgery and a UCL surgery?
So those are, I guess, in definition, those are the same procedure. Now, if we go back to, and this is probably where they're getting the difference, if you go back to the original procedure that was done by Joe out in L.A., the pitcher Tommy John, that's where the name came from. So it's ironically not the surgeon who was named after, it was the patient. So that was a reconstruction of the UCL. Now, we've touched on it. There's been a little bit more of a kind of a popularized procedure where we repair the UCL. So if you're actually talking about UCL repair versus a reconstruction would be Tommy John repair. Now, sometimes those are used interchangeably, so people will say UCL repair. But if you're really getting down into the specifics, that's where we're actually doing that little suture and a couple anchors to kind of brace the ligament and then allow it to heal in, as opposed to going in there and removing what's there and then taking, usually it's either going to be one of the hamstring grafts or a tendon from your forearm, and then weaving a new graft in its place. So in the strictest of terms, that's a UCL reconstruction, which is a Tommy John procedure, versus a UCL repair, where you're trying to keep the ligament where it's not fully torn. You're trying to basically stabilize it and allow it to heal in. That's where you put anchors and sutures.
So that would make sense. I was looking at one pitcher, says Tyler Wells. He had right UCL repair surgery, and on a note it said he didn't need Tommy John surgery. So that kind of what you just explained there, the difference.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're discussing reconstruction, now the problem is when you get into the lay terms, sometimes those are used interchangeably. So it's important to kind of distinguish which one was actually done. And in fact, to take it one step further, there are some people that are now popularizing doing them simultaneously. So doing the reconstruction and then augmenting it with a repair on top of that. So you get kind of both of them. You try put the anchor to support it and you reconstruct it. So that's what we call throwing the kitchen sink at it.
Yeah, no kidding. Brandon Woodruff, I know we've talked about him with that shoulder injury quite a bit. He came out in the media just a couple days ago, says he wanted to kind of fix the narrative out there. Some people wondering if he had suffered a setback, because I think it was Pat Murphy a couple weeks ago said that he's not going to be ready for spring training and probably not for the season. But today he's facing batters for the first time since he suffered that injury. So when we got a pitcher going out there, Austin, he's facing batters for the first time, about 20 pitches, they said. What's going to be the biggest thing that maybe doctors or trainers are going to be looking for Brandon Woodruff after he goes through that BP session?
Well, I mean, there's going to be, during it, you're going to look at mechanics and see how the actual throw is coming across. So making sure that he's using good form and kind of what his throw form is supposed to be. Because everyone's got their own little style. So you want to make sure that looks good. Then you want to make sure that afterwards there's no lingering symptoms. So as you get back, is it sore, and specifically in his case where their surgery was done, to make sure that it is indeed behaving itself. And what they'll do is, I mean, that's really when you look at recovery from any shoulder elbow surgery in pitchers, they have very, very strict return to pitching protocols. And so that's why they're saying, and they'll announce it. They'll say, well, he's going to do 20 pitches, and then the next time it'll be 25 or 30 or whatever. And they slowly. So even if the pitcher goes out there and says, I feel great, I want to throw 50, it's like, nope, we're sticking to our guns. And you slowly build it back up, because what you do is that at some point there's going to be a speed bump. So there's going to be something that gets irritated. You want to make sure it only gets a little bit irritated as opposed to really significant setbacks. And so that's really the goal, is to avoid those big setbacks in the recovery phase. So they go in these very slow incremental returns, and so they're going to look at mechanics during and kind of any issues that arise afterwards. And as long as it feels good, you stick to the protocol. Now, if it's a big setback, then sometimes you have to deviate from the protocol, and that's where guys will go backwards on the protocol or kind of stay at that level for a while until it feels better. And that's just going to be kind of determined by how he feels.
Giannis has a calf strain again. He's not going to be playing in the All-Star game, and he's missed the last few games here and such. And I feel like it's every year we've kind of had a calf strain issue when it comes to Giannis. Mm-hmm. Now, in your position, when there's an athlete that kind of has a repeat injury, like a soft tissue injury like this, is there something that you guys look for that's a common thing? Or my flashback was when Packers sent Christian Watson and Eric Stokes down to Madison to get tested for their hamstrings and such. Do you guys kind of look for what are some of the things that he's maybe doing that always suffers a calf injury, or is it just one of those fluke things? It just happens to be another calf injury this year.
I mean, I think it's probably both, truthfully. So I mean, there are things that you can be doing wrong mechanically. So it's a form thing. It can be a flexibility thing. It can be an improper warm-up thing. Now, I would imagine the amount of money they've invested in Giannis, I doubt he's just kind of going out there, cold turkey without any warm-up. So my assumption is that he's probably getting plenty of warm-up and doing a lot of stretching and warming up. So I doubt it's that. And I'm guessing they're also trying to get him loose and limber. So I doubt it's that. If we go back to the actual injury itself, so what is the strain of a calf in this case? Generally speaking, it's the junction between the muscle and the tendon. And that interface, when it's injured, the problem is that it doesn't heal with normal tissue. So there's basically a scar that will develop at that interface. And so that area is always more predisposed to re-injury. So when people have a real significant, whether it's groin, hamstring, calf, you name it, when they have a significant injury, they unfortunately are always going to be a little bit more predisposed to re-injuring that. And so especially when you have a guy like Giannis, I mean, when he does his Euro step, you just think about the physics of what's actually happening with his body. It's surprising he doesn't get hurt more often, really.
Mm-hmm.
So he'll have that area that's again prone to injury. Now, again, they're going to do everything they can to warm it up, keep it loose, stretch, etc. But clearly, it's something that's been. I mean, what is that? At least it's probably his third time injuring it, I would say, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
More. So that's going to be one thing. I mean, you can sometimes try to do different, shockwave therapy, steroid injections to try and decrease that scar tissue. But unfortunately, it just never goes back exactly to the way it was before. And so that does put them in, again, that higher risk category. The hope is that you can mitigate it with those things I alluded to, where people, maximize the warm-up and stretching and maximize the proper form with doing things. But sometimes when you're just pushing your body to that limit, it pushes back.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you this because I saw this. I can't remember who said it. It was some commentator in that. But the frustration with some of these NBA players, load management, whatever we want to call it. And they use the comparison like, you had a couple of Philadelphia Eagles offensive linemen who were dealing with back injuries and some really tough injuries, yet they're going out there, they're blocking 300-pound defensive linemen, they're going out there and playing. And I think the comparison they use is that Paul George had a finger injury and he's out multiple games and such. I mean, as somebody in your position, is that fair to kind of compare those type of injuries? Is it just, different mindsets? I mean, Eagles were in the playoffs for crying out loud, so maybe it was a little bit different with basketball. But what kind of goes through your mind when you hear somebody say that?
Yeah, I mean, there is, without a doubt, just differences in the approach between sports. So, I mean, you'll see that. But I will say this. If you look at the context of when it's in the season, I can promise you if he'd had that injury, Paul George, and they were in the NBA Finals, he's playing, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the load management during the season, and the whole purpose of load management is to allow them to be ready when they're needed most, which is going to be playoffs, right? So when you see that in the NFL, there are guys who will sit earlier in the season and not necessarily an injury that they would sit if they were in the playoffs or certainly the Super Bowl. So there's that part of it. And the other thing, too, is you look at the sport. I mean, NFL, there's, I guess now 17 games in this season. Each one of them is much more important than an individual basketball game. So it's much more, if they started doing load management in the NFL, people would riot. It just, it just wouldn't work. So each game is just so much more important. So I think there's a lot of things that go into it. But, and then to take one step further, the sport themselves. So, basketball is, if you really want to look at it, has a lot more finesse than football. Football is guys banging into each other as fast as they can, as hard as they can. Not that doesn't happen to a certain extent in the basketball court, but there's more finesse involved. And so when you have an injury that's like a quote, just a finger, if that affects their ability to dribble and shoot, that affects their ability to play effectively. So they may not be able to play through things where an NFL player can tape it up. And it's like, look, in the whole line, they don't necessarily need that finesse or fine motor. It's more of like, all right, we're going to bash on each other here. So it is apples to oranges for sure. So I don't know if you necessarily can say, look, this guy's tougher than that guy. On a side note, though, if you look at the level of flopping occurring in the NBA, that's always been something that I think is getting worse and worse. So that being said, there was clearly some video evidence of Mahomes doing it too in the playoffs and leading up to that. I think that obviously irritated people. So there is kind of the quote culture of the sport. I think it's just not as tolerated in some sports as others, but it is apples to oranges. So I'd say it is an unfair comparison just because there's a lot of differences.
Mm-hmm. He's Dr. Austin Crowe, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine, Inside the Training Room. Reminder, you can check out, we've got Inside the Training Room podcast. It's up every Friday afternoon if you miss any of these conversations, so you can get that wherever you get your podcasts or at sportstalk1051.com. Dude, appreciate the time as always, buddy. Have yourself a fantastic weekend, and we'll catch up with you again soon, okay?
Absolutely. Stay warm out there.
Yeah, you too, man. And be careful on the roads, too, it sounds like, coming up later on.
Yeah,
so.
a little slippery. Yeah, take care.
Yeah, you too. Dr. Austin Crowe, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine.